Hey everyone, welcome to the inaugural Wisdom podcast from the British Association of Anger Management, or BAAM, to use its apt acronym. The Wisdom podcast is a new project from BAAM, combining therapeutic knowledge with discussion, communication, analysis, and even a little spirituality. If you want to tune into future podcasts, hit the subscribe button for the YouTube page or the Facebook page. And you can also sign up to the newsletter at angermanage.co.uk. I'm your host for today. My name is Steve Beale. I'm a journalist who met BAAM's founder Mike Fisher when I wrote about anger management for the men's magazine Arena, and we've worked together on and off ever since. Now, this is the first virtual panel I've ever hosted as opposed to a live one. So guys, please be gentle with me on your Twitter machines. Today, we're going to be talking about toxic anger, the kind that's expressed unhealthily, and how at large in the world it seems to be right now. And what we kind of find ourselves in right now is perhaps what we could call an age of rage. And there's an article written by Mike and his mentor Snake, who you're going to meet in a minute, on the British Association of Anger Management website that you can read as you listen along. Now, it's a big subject to discuss. So to make sure we've got all the most important angles covered, we got in some of the biggest guns that are available to us. I'm delighted to say that some of the most trenchant commentators we have available have made some time on a Saturday afternoon, and I'm going to introduce them to you all now. Sharina Brown is a barrister specializing in equality, diversity, and media law, who's won awards for her unpaid pro bono work. Hey, Sharina, how's it going? Sharina's also an actress who's played, for example, Antonio in the Brockley Jack Theatre's acclaimed 2018 all-female version of The Tempest, and runs her own theatre group. Horizon, what's the proper pronunciation, Sharina? You told me before. Aversion Productions, and still finds time for her marriage and 3 children. Sharina, you terrible overachiever, welcome this afternoon to the podcast.
Thank you, Steve.
And joining us from Minneapolis in the USA, Craig Snake Bloomstrand. Snake is a former engineer who's been a therapist for over 25 years and describes himself as a social field worker. He's worked not only with business and military leaders, but with high security prisoners and battlefield veterans. His books, Every Story Comes to an End and Every Story Casts a Shadow, are available now, and you can see more of his writing at goodmenproject.com and elephantjournal.com. Snake, welcome to the Wisdom Podcast today.
Good to be here. I'm glad to join you. It is a large topic.
Next, Dr. Stephen Blumenthal is one of the UK's top experts on toxic behaviour. His writing is published regularly in The Guardian, The Daily Telegraph, and The Psychologist, and his books Assessing Risk, A Relational Approach is out now. Hey, Stephen, how you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Good to be here.
Stephen, I'm going to be Steve, yeah, in case there's any confusion, all right? Both spell it the proper way with a PH. Last but not least, Mike Fisher is the founder of BAAM and a leading global anger management therapist who is rarely away from our newspapers or TV screens. His books, Beating Anger, plus Mindfulness and the Art of Anger Management, are available to buy now. The Wisdom Podcast is his brainchild. So, hey, Mike, and thanks for bringing us all together today.
Thanks, Steve.
Hey, Mike. So let's talk a bit about the age of rage, from snapping at colleagues to domestic violence and internet trolling to terrorism. Humanity seems to have found itself in an age of rage. There's road rage for driving denouements, cubicle rage for office outbursts, and my own favorite, lane rage, which is when you're in the swimming pool in the lines and you're in the fast lane and the person in front of you isn't swimming fast enough. But there are also wider sort of macro rage instances. which one assumes to be more political or culturally driven, perhaps. Now, Mike, you and Snake wrote about the age of rage on the BAAM website this week. Perhaps you could start by telling us what rage in this particular context is and how it differs from anger, including sort of chronic anger, perhaps.
So to put it very, very simply, anger is being able to say to somebody, I'm angry with you. And I often talk about be as angry as you want, but you can also be kind. Now, rage is something completely different. According to Freud, he says that rage is like mini madness. And I'm sure at some point, Stephen Blumenthal will probably say something about that. But that's about the closest I can get. When we act our anger out, we kind of cross boundaries and we do a lot of damage and a lot of harm. That's what I would describe as rage.
Mm-hmm. So anger in itself is an emotion. It can be used very constructively. And I think you mentioned in the article as well that rage is not entirely useless to humanity. And, we can go into that a bit later as well. But generally, rage is when we lose control, when we start objectifying other people, when we're not at our best, but we're at our worst, kind of thing. And it is generally destructive and to be avoided, or preferable to express our anger healthily rather than in a rage state.
Absolutely. So I'm all for people expressing anger, but we have to be clear about that definition. And I think as we go deep into the conversation, that will become clearer. So, we talk about rage, we talk about outrage, we talk about furiosity. That is where it becomes dangerous, it becomes volatile, and there's a lot of damage done. That's the stuff we're going to be spending time talking about this afternoon. But I 100% support people expressing and communicating their feeling of anger, but we can still be kind at the same time.
Yeah. So, Stephen, if I could bring you in next, how do we see the age of rage playing out right now? And I know you've been writing quite a lot during the last few months in the broadsheets about the various ways that sort of unhealthy emotional expressions could be bubbling up.
One of the articles I wrote recently was called Social Claustrophobia, and it was concerned with the question of the increase in domestic violence, for example, during lockdown, and also the increased divorce rate in China, for example. And I think that is partly a consequence of actually being forced together, being locked in, having to share space in close proximity to one another, when usually we have the opportunity to be able to get out, to be able to let off steam elsewhere. So how does the current circumstance deal with that? I think in thinking about this particular podcast, I was thinking that the age of rage, what is it about our particular moment in history, which is the age of rage? In some ways, you might say, well, it's not an age of rage because actually, historically, homicides, for example, are at their lowest that they have been. We're much more civilized as a culture than ever before. But the social claustrophobia in our moment in with lockdown is actually very relevant to this question because, of course, there are more of us on the planet right now. So it means that there's a greater density. We bump into each other much more. And fundamentally, I think what is particularly important about this moment is that technology has increased to amplify rage in a very unusual way, so that some nutter, for example, can sort of create, can get their hands on the sort of a mode of destruction much more powerful, like a suicide bomber, for example. Another area where that plays itself out is obviously on the internet as well, in terms of social media, where you can hide behind you can hide behind anonymity and cause maximum destruction out there by sending out a Twitter, a tweet or some kind of post, which obviously has a huge implication for other people. So I think all these modes of the technology has really improved our capacity for destruction, really. And I think that's probably why it is so relevant to talk about an age of rage right now.
Right, I see. And obviously it's not just sort of lockdown that we see in the news at the moment. Sharina, people will be watching and taking part in protests on behalf of the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, could you perhaps tell us how that has been a vehicle for discussion around some very valid forms of anger and rage?
Yeah, sure, Steve. But before I do that, I ought to make clear that I'm a comparative lay person on this panel, and I wouldn't describe myself as a big gun. But having said that, I think I do have some valid contributions to make in relation to the discussion of anger around the Black Lives Matter movement. And perhaps it's less of a discussion and more of an outlet for rage and an expression of anger. And I don't think it's really been focused on that aspect of the movement as a tool for change, because it's quite right that perhaps on a micro level, so one-to-one, an explosive expression of anger can be very damaging, clearly. But on a macro community level, is it sometimes the case that when a community that has been suppressed and effectively had to contain their anger, and when something like the killing, the unlawful killing of George Floyd happens, and they are then, the community moved to rage, is it then a useful tool for change? And in my view, it can be. And perhaps it's actually very important. I think it's an example of these, sorts of movements throughout human history of oppressed people who, once they have tried, if you like, the legitimate avenues open to them to change their situation, eventually move to a violent expression of anger, of rage, out of frustration and an inability to go anywhere else effectively. And so that's why we see, in my view, this outpouring of anger and rage on our streets all over the globe. And I know that some commentators have been very negative about, for example, the burning, the looting, the tearing down of statues and defacing of other public monuments. But again, we do have to ask whether that is a legitimate form of protest to a historically oppressed people who have had no recourse, as they see it, to justice. And so I think we need to ask ourselves, is it in those circumstances legitimate? And yes, I would say that people move slowly to arms in those situations, but when they do get the ear of the authorities, because, for example, what we've seen is a debate now, as we've never seen before on the other side of the Atlantic, to me obviously, of, for example, defunding the police, serious conversations about equality and diversity in organizations, in our in our huge global organizations as I have not seen before in my lifetime. So paradoxically, although the title of this conversation is about toxic rage, and by its very nature how damaging that can be to our private relationships, it clearly has a place, in my view, on a global political stage.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things there. Firstly, yeah, I mean, you, as a barrister, you work with, you've worked with a lot of sort of disenfranchised black men. Is that fair to say? So
I have disenfranchised men across the board, actually.
So I'm qualified to speak about this subject. And yeah, I mean, what you say, it does seem to be a disconnect about our societal authority structure, that violence, or social violence, rioting is seen as beyond the pale, but at the same time it does seem to get things done. I mean, in my own personal experience as a young man, I remember the poll tax riots, and that seemingly being the only time that the government of the time sort of listened to the people. Not that I personally think government should always listen to the people, but yeah, there does seem to be a sort of disconnect there on a political level between how governments view social unrest and how they actually react to it. And we're going to talk a bit later about the system and whether that is whether it is currently functional at dealing with the effects of rage, especially in young men or disenfranchised people. And I mean, on that point as well about containing rage and using it where it isn't, or where it is appropriate, or not using it where it isn't appropriate. Snake, you said in the article that prisoners and soldiers, and you've worked with both groups extensively, have techniques for recognizing, containing, and focusing rage. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, and to spin off what was just said too, one of the things that I've been a fierce advocate for is being able to accurately interpret emotion. And it seems in our culture we've been taught to suppress emotion, deny it, as opposed to acknowledge it and learn to interpret it. So I don't know, I'm on the edge in terms of, is it a valuable tool to know rage? I've seen it used poorly and seen it used well. Combat soldiers, violent gang members, people who act that out and tap into rage to dominate or control. It's definitely a tool. Whether it's a good tool or a bad tool is on the fence. But it comes back to the whole topic of, the unrest that we have going on in Minneapolis right now. In part,
you're in Minneapolis. Sorry, just for the viewers.
Is years of suppressed reaction to inequality, to poverty, to lack of access. And there's emotion that goes along with all of that. And the more it's pushed back, the more tendency there is for it to go to rage. Now, out on the streets during the protests here, there were people genuinely protest, and there were just angry people looking to get theirs.
Yeah.
Oh. It looks like somebody's sniped Snake.
It never ends. But my point being, I think it's incredibly important that all of us are able to explore our own emotions. I see it basically as two horses that are meant to pull together your intellect and emotion. And unfortunately, we focus largely on the intellect and very little on the emotion, develop little ability to accurately interpret what the emotions are telling us. And in that suppression comes rage, implosion, or explosion.
And is there any, and these techniques you mentioned that soldiers and prisoners use, is there any that you have taken into your sort of wider therapy and introduced to people who maybe aren't in quite as compressed a situation as a soldier or a high security inmate?
Definitely, because at least there's a familiarity amongst those individuals with their own rage that does inform me when I'm working with people who say, not me, I don't have any rage. I'm a little angry from time to time, but it never gets to rage. It's that denial that I find I can draw from the experience of people who are familiar with their own rage and ask if it's applicable to an individual client who just never considered it.
Right. Mm-hmm. And I noticed just then you talked about compressed emotions, which
Right.
sounds like something that we could all empathize with. But Mike, do you want to talk a bit about compressed emotions, or
I'll tell you what I'd like to do. I want to just go back, because one of my talents is to hang back, listen, and then respond. I want to just pick up on some of the things that both Sharina as well as Snake has mentioned, because I'm trying to get a sense of the difference between really taking Black Lives Matter seriously. And I do think there is something to be said about the extremity of the outrage, the violence. And why I want to say that is because I think those who were not just furious, but outraged, wanted the system to take them seriously. So it's like, if you don't take us seriously, this is what is going to happen. We're going to burn down your towns. We're going to burn down your cities. So take us seriously. And I think within the context of anger, when we act our anger out, it's essentially saying, take us seriously. Take what it is that I'm saying seriously. Now, of course, within the context of anger management, we can say it in a very different way. We don't have to act our anger out. We can find a language. We can find a voice for that part of us. So I think that's a worthwhile contribution based on what's being said, because I've been struggling with that. People say, and I saw a comment earlier up on the screen, is well, it's great to demonstrate, but when it actually becomes violent and it becomes theft and crime, burning down cars, etc., stealing from shops, that's a different conversation. But I don't know whether it actually is. There has to be a channel for that anger, rage, and fury. And I'm not supporting it at all. That's not the point I'm making. The point that I'm making is that it's an indication of saying, if you want to get us this angry, this is the direction we can go in. We prefer not to, because we prefer to be peaceful. But don't push us too far, because this is what happens. And I don't know what the panel's view is, but I do think that is worthwhile at least having a conversation about.
Yeah. If I could just, sorry, Snake, I'll let you go.
Yeah, no,
right.
just quickly.
All right.
I see anger and rage as somewhat of a gateway drug. What people really push back from the table is what really is at stake once you peel back the anger and rage is grief and loss. The people on the streets had grief and loss in spades, and that's the thing we're hesitant to look at as a culture.
Yeah, I would agree. I think after the outpouring of rage, I think in your article you mentioned that once someone expresses their anger in an explosive fashion, then perhaps there's this feeling of remorse and guilt after the way they have behaved, and query whether some of the protesters we've seen in the streets have gone back to the privacy of their homes, feeling guilt and remorse over the way they acted. But certainly what I have seen on social media is grief, but associated not with the violence that has been meted out by a small minority, let's be clear, of protesters, but really a grief over how it is that we are still in this position in 2020. That's the overwhelming grief that I am tapping into. It really is. And it's very emotional. And it's really given people, I think, Black people, a renewed, if you like, honesty and openness with their emotions. You know, I'm seeing, you know, young Black men posting about, you know, depression and sadness and grief in a way that I've never seen, frankly. And I have worked with a lot of Black men who were clearly dealing with grief, but they didn't articulate it in that way. But they're finding that language now. But what I wanted to say also was about, you know, Snake, Mike, you've both mentioned suppression of emotions and how that can then lead to rage and toxic anger and toxic rage. But what I see going on in the Black Lives Matter protest is really an expression of the fact that the social contract has broken down. It's you know, we had an agreement that we would allow the state via the police to police our communities. And for generations, they have been in breach of that contract because they have over-policed our poor and Black communities and have done and policed in an aggressive way. So, you know, I thought it was interesting when I was reading your article, and one of the questions that came up in my mind is police brutality an example of rage? You know, it is, in my view, self-sabotaging, and it is chronic. It objectifies others, namely Black men, and gives permission for the police in these situations to forego the respect for Black people as human beings. So I think actually police brutality is an expression of rage. And when we see that meted out time and time again, then the people will rise up and say, we no longer consent to you policing our community. Yes. And so our rage is legitimate.
Yes.
Guys, has anyone done any work with law enforcement or the authorities in these areas before? Or are there any sort of recommendations? What's kind of going on? I mean, because as a journalist once, I spent a day in the back of the 999 car. And I'm also kind of aware that the individuals the police send round to your house when you get burgled are kind of different to the ones that you meet at the protest as well. I'm kind of aware of that. And the law enforcement is, they're human beings, and how can they be helped with negative emotions in these particular areas?
You know, to spin off what Sharina was saying too, maybe a inaccurate or an awkward statement to make, but right now so much is being projected on police, most of whom I know are there to do the right job. But just spinning off what Sharina said, the violence in the Black community and the policing of the Black community does come close to sanctioned expression of that built-up rage. It's a reach to go that far to speak it, but to make my point, we send these people out, men and women, day after day after day, into impossible situations. We bring them back to the police station, say, thanks for your shift, you're on your way. There is no decompression. And I see the same thing with military. We send men downrange, men and women downrange. They're subject to trauma, hardcore trauma, day in and day out. And we really have not effectively dealt with the blowback or the decompression that's required afterwards. I've talked to servicemen who, thanks to modern transportation, leave the battle zone, come home, and in 24 hours, they're standing in Chicago in their apartment, opening the refrigerator. How do you make the emotional transition from battlefield preparedness to being home and back in your family? It's such a reach to think that people can do this job day in and day out without it leaving a bruise.
Yeah, I was thinking along those lines, Snake. I guess what is really important here is the cycle of violence, isn't it? That the more brutal you're treated, the more violent you're going to become, and so on, and so the kind of cycle goes on and on, which becomes sort of never ending for, especially in relation to a community, but also individually. Almost, I think every person I've ever worked with who's got a problem with rage has always been mistreated, has always had done to them what they then do to others. So you sort of, what is called identifying with the aggressor, the person who, in order to survive that experience of humiliation and shame, you sort of adopt then a position of re-victimizing other people and putting them in the position that you were in when you were younger, but also scaling that up to a community level. There's a issue about the Black community, and also overlaying that is obviously socioeconomic status. It's quite interesting actually that there was a article recently in Nature, the scientific journal Nature, which said that the biggest factor associated with risk of death from coronavirus was actually socioeconomic status. It increases your risk threefold, which is more than any other factor. That got me thinking about the science of all of this, which is that neuroscience actually reveals evidence for 3 different kinds of rage. There are 7 affective systems in the brain, or 3 sort of passions, so to speak, of which rage is one of them. Others are care, play, lust, and some others which I can't think of off the top of my head right now. But within the rage system, you actually have evidence for either proactive aggression or reactive aggression. And then there's one other, which is social dominance aggression as well. Now, in relation to the reactive aggression, that is like the fight-flight response. So we see a danger, either we run away or we confront it and fight. Now, if you stimulate that part of the brain of an animal or even a human being, they will bite or attack whatever in front of them without being able to explain, in the case of humans, what it is that they're attacking, or why they won't be able to make sense of why they're attacking what's in front of them. Now, the interesting thing is, in relation to the proactive aggression system, that's quite different. When you stimulate that part of the brain, the animal will actually enjoy it, so to speak. So they will actually self-stimulate by pressing the lever in order to elicit that electric activity, which will stimulate that part of the brain. And I think that's really interesting when it comes down to this whole question, because I think what you can see is that there's a kind of violence relating to tragedy, which is the fact that we're, the kind of random attack, the fight-flight type response is a kind of tragic kind of violence. But then you've got a much more problematic type, which is violence as tyranny. And I think this is much more associated with this kind of enjoyment of the stimulation of the rage system. And I was just thinking about that in relation to this question that was being discussed about Black Lives Matter, and just more generally, just about how rage can be something that is trying to address an injustice and put right an injustice, and how in the sort of the other aspect of being human is that we actually do have a tendency towards tyranny. And this is where it becomes much more problematic, where violence becomes gratuitous and sort of partly enjoyable. And that can be, that's where you get into sort of the areas of sort of sadism and so on, which I think is a much more sort of problematic area of rage.
Yeah, I want to let me go back a few steps. I just want to pick up on the comment you made earlier on, Snake, which is around grief and loss, underlying anger, and I also want to pick up on the point that you're making as well, Stephen. And one of the things I know in the programs I deliver on, there are three types of groups there's three types of group dynamics that I'm faced with. The one is the angry bunch. Now, actually, the angry bunch, we don't have too many of those, believe it or not, simply because when they arrive, they'll complain about the heating, they'll complain about the seating, they're complaining about how difficult it was to get there, etc., etc. The dominant groups that we have, the two of them is the fear-based group, but it's fear-shame-based group. And then the other one is the grief-based group. And it's quite extraordinary. When I think about the client group that I work with, they are clearly heartbroken. And that's often, really a big surprise when I say to people, actually, are you aware of just how heartbroken you are? So that's the one point I want to make. And then, of course, it touches something deep in them, and then they just, bawl their eyes out. The point that you're making, Steve, I just want to pick up on it because I think that level of rage and fury that's being spoken about in terms of being adrenalized, the fight-flight mechanism, it's like extreme sport. There's something about being an adrenaline junkie that kind of stimulates them and they get absolutely high on. And then, of course, you have the come down where you're dealing with the shame and you're dealing with the remorse. But while it's actually happening, it's an extraordinary event. And as you know, the term contagious, developed by Daniel Goleman, it becomes contagious. So you might even have people who go to a peaceful demonstration, get caught up in those environments, and then act out in the way that we're talking about. So that's my 2 pence worth.
Mm-hmm.
Guys, we've spoken about compressed emotions a couple of times. Who wants to take that one on and explain about that and how human beings are dealing with that?
The genesis of that started when I began working with military, and the whole notion of being broken and needing fixing, that language did not work. However, so many of these men and women are geared towards training. And so the notion of, do you know when you're emotionally compressed, and do you have methods that you've used to decompress? That shift in language made the work far more accessible and made it far more willing to take a look. And so I use that quite a bit. The notion of denial or suppression is compression. And to compress those emotions results in either an implosion or an explosion. So that's a clearer way to put those two terms.
And why do we compress our emotions, Mike?
Well, those are two terms, but the kind of the technical term, Snake, is the imploder and the exploder. So usually what will happen with the imploder, they'll suck it in until they can no longer contain it, and then they will explode.
Mm-hmm.
That will happen. So I think there's something between the compression and the decompression. It's the decompression happens when they, of course, explode. But there is this saying, and I don't know what your view is, Stephen, but there is this saying that depression is anger turned inwards. Now I know that depression is a very big subject and it's a broad spectrum. But I remember one of the comments that Fritz Perls made. He said that depression is anger turned inwards. So there's a lot of, when you talk about compression, Snake, there is something about the amount of energy we have to use to stuff the anger But, what I often say about anger, it has to go somewhere. It's like a rogue feeling. It's like rage, but of course not as extreme. And so there is something to be said is that we put a lot of energy into repressing all our feelings, not just anger. But anger is a rogue feeling. It's the only one that has its own energy. And of course, that's when you get this overflow.
So there seems to be, in my mind, a common theme here of not having a legitimate outlet for anger, or a legitimate outlet for the clean expression of anger. And I'm thinking now about what Snake said about being able to get back to the station, or your wherever it is, if you're a soldier, back to the unit, and there is no mechanism for them to decompress, and that seems to me a flaw in the system.
There's also another part that I want to mention too, is if you dampen down the anger, it's the whole system. You dampen down compassion. You dampen down so many other emotions. So we're not simply dealing with the emotion anger. It's the whole system that we end up dampening down. And it makes it difficult to feel joy and so many other emotions. It's a whole system.
Well, rage is not a cancer, right? It's passion. There's a lovely quote from the film The Third Man, where at the end of the film, the main character, Harry Lime, says something like, in Italy, you had 30 years of the Borgias and bloodshed, violence, etc. And that produced Michelangelo, Leonardo, and the Renaissance. And in Switzerland, you had 400 years of brotherly love. And what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. The quote goes something like. So it is a kind of source of creativity, isn't it? It's like, I absolutely agree with the point. And I think it is also linked to this point about loss and grief. And also coming back to that point about the system preventing the expression. So it's partly the system, I think, and then partly the people within it, and being able to have a kind of lexicon of language to be able to express that, to be able to express that passion in a creative way rather than in a way that can turn to destruction. And I guess this is one of the things. I mean, I also work with a range of different people, the kind of more the sort of the angry, as it were, but also people in high security situations as well, where actually what you realize is that they just haven't got that kind of language to describe their inner experiences, and being able to begin to articulate what's going on inside, and to be able to sort of name different feelings. I think mindfulness is quite an interesting technique, because it's a way of actually sort of allowing all your different emotions to surface and to be able to look at them without kind of pushing them away, but actually allow them to come to you. But if they're frightening, if those feelings are frightening, like, for example, vulnerability, if you're really scared, if you've experienced a situation where your vulnerability has been attacked, then when that experience is triggered in life, for example, in an intimate relationship, then you're going to be triggered to violence, to defend yourself, to overcome the threat.
So, guys, as the layman here, I'm confused, because I thought we were in a sort of touchy-feely age where we were all being encouraged to express our emotions. What's gone wrong?
Oh my God! Look, I think there, if I go back to when I started training as a therapist 30 years ago, well, in fact, it's just a handful of men and it was just full of women, like 40 people and there were like 3 men. So, my view is that women are much closer to their emotional narrative or their emotional landscape versus men. But I can tell you, Steve, that, however many anger management programs I've delivered on, it's extraordinary to see the amount of people, when I ask who's done counseling or psychotherapy or group therapy, you might only see like 2 or 3 hands go up. And it's like, how have, the other 15 or 20 people been able to sustain themselves emotionally for that long? So, I think there's a myth. And, I joke about this as well. I talk about, if you're living in Los Angeles or in California and you don't have a therapist, there's definitely something wrong with you. Or if you're living in New York and you don't have an analyst, you're a weirdo. Whereas, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was completely the other way around. But I do want to just, if I can come back to this, I just want to pick up on what you were saying, Sharina, and I fully support what's being said. A lot of what I do, a lot of what we do is we giving, one of the best presentations that I do is based on what we call the feeling compass, giving people a narrative to communicate their feelings. They're blown away by it. It's quite extraordinary. It's like, oh my God, why didn't we learn this at school? And, I ran a men's group for many, many years, and you'll know about the snake, the amount of men that we've worked with who don't have a narrative for feelings, but yet they feel so intensely. So, what part of what we do is we teach them a narrative. That's what we do. So that when their anger kicks in, we start the conversation by saying, I feel angry with you. But it also goes for sadness or hurt or shame or fear. So I think there's something about, the process is a process of education. And if you're not getting it at home, you're coming to organizations like ourselves or practitioners like yourselves, where we're teaching people skill in being able to learn. I think the correct word is a new vernacular, if that is the correct word, or a new narrative. But I like the word vernacular.
And so,
to address your question too, Steve, part of where we've gone wrong, and I can own this for myself, I didn't want to go and look at my emotions. When I was first confronted with that work, it's like, no way am I going to open that Pandora's box. I'll never get it shut again. It's an irrational fear. Everybody does have emotions, whether they'll acknowledge them or not. But there is this phenomenal fear that keeps people away from digging deep, fearful that they're damaged goods and will never be able to get the containment up again. And it's a myth.
Sorry, I think it comes back to what Stephen was saying earlier on. I think there's something to be said about vulnerability. The pure terror of being vulnerable, because that's a weakness. And as long as we support and propagate that message, that's what will continue to happen.
Serena,
can I just add here? I'd just like to add one other point, because you see, there is another angle to this. I always tend to kind of adopt the opposite position to whatever's being talked about. But, what if not everybody wants to talk about wear their heart on their sleeve, so to speak? And there are people who just want to kind of go and punch a punch bag or get out on the sports field and, run around and release things like that. I don't think there should be a hard and fast rule that I'm just very wary of this kind of culture of like that we're kind of selling the idea that everybody talks about their feelings and then everything's going to be better, because there's such a range of different ways that people approach these things. Some people prefer to go and have a pint and watch a game of football or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, as I was listening to that discussion, I was thinking about, my father and his generation. And of course, there was no vernacular for what we are talking about now. And he used to play amateur cricket, and he would play this every weekend, and then he and his teammates would go to the pub. And I think that was their form of therapy and their outlet. And it seems to me that what is happening now in the modern world is that there are fewer of those situations available, particularly, I think, to our men. You know, I have 2 sons, and I have an 18-year-old son, and I think about how many places he has, how many spaces, safe spaces he has to express his emotions, whether it be anger or happiness. And they're far and few between. He used to play rugby, and that was the one place where he was encouraged to express rage anger in a controlled way. I mean, it was quite impressive. I was against the whole rugby playing thing. I thought it was just organized fighting, violence. But it was quite impressive how these very young boys, you know, he started when he was 9, would, as the referee would yell stop, they would stop. And the respect both to the referee and other players was always there. And I wonder whether there are just fewer places in society now for our young men and men generally to express their emotions in a safe space.
I really like what you say there, Sharina, because I think, the feminist writer Camille Paglia, who's actually a bit sort of controversial in this area, I actually agree with her point when she says that the education system is very much geared towards girls, actually. And there's a sort of, I think there is that kind of culture around, which is a kind of almost feminizing of boys, which, as if masculinity by definition is toxic, which is quite wrong. So her argument is that in schools, you know, sitting down for hours and hours, learning is very much what is geared towards girls rather than boys, to actually need to be able to run around and play rugby and so on. And, you know, obviously rugby is a bit dangerous, but this idea of, you know, that rugby has to become sort of touch rugby and that it has to be sort of inclusive of boys and girls. I think there are some serious questions that our sort of, the cancel culture really needs to address.
I agree with that in terms of, I think that's one of the differences between masculine and feminine in terms of the topic of anger, is that boys have so many opportunities through sport to take it right up to the edge, whereas there are few of those opportunities available for women. It isn't that women don't play sports, but the violent aspect of it, I know for me it was hockey, and we'd go and knock each other around like crazy, and we learned the limits that, you know, okay, that's a bit too far, but we at least walked up to those limits. And I don't see those opportunities, certainly not for my daughters.
No.
Life has become too sanitized, doesn't it?
Well, I was just about to interject that. I don't know about how the curriculum in the States, or where in the state you're in, Snake, but where in London, we have, as a parent, I have seen a reduction in the number of contact sports allowed to be played at school for fear of an injury and then, you know, an inevitable lawsuit, perhaps. There's a sort of culture of risk aversion around these sorts of sports. So that you know, they're not offered when they are, I think, important for girls as well as boys. You know, I play hockey
definitely,
and softball, and I was very sporty, and it was an important outlet for me.
There's a couple of girls in my mixed martial arts class that would give anyone on this Zoom call a run for their money. I was really interested because we did actually have a question from Marsha via email, and she asked, I mean, how about women's rage? Is it less socially acceptable and more threatening than male rage?
I think female rage is, I was going to say it's becoming more prevalent, but I just think it's being recorded more.
Right.
So exposed more, exactly. Exposed more. But there is this sense, I think, that it is more frowned upon for women to express their anger in a violent way. And that is because, you know, no doubt there's been a lot of movement towards equality of the sexes. But the reality is that it is still an overwhelmingly chauvinistic world. And so if we're seen to express, I mean, even down to swearing in public, you know, I think that is frowned upon by a generation of men who are not accustomed to seeing women expressing their anger in an explosive way.
I certainly worked in a very traditional office where it was no swearing in front of the lasses. But when the lasses weren't around, you were expected to turn the air a deep shade of blue. But
also there's very sanctions for women who are seen as aggressive. So, you know, for many years I was a criminal advocate, and although, you know, sort of assertiveness on the part of my client was very much encouraged, I lived in fear of being branded, you know, a difficult, aggressive bitch. You know, that's what we would be called, and be given a wide berth. So there's a culture around women in the workplace, I think, that means that if I consider it assertiveness, but if you're viewed as aggressive, then you're given this label.
I think anybody who's worked in a women's prison will attest to the fact that they're extremely violent places. And I guess every violent male has had a mother. And when you get them into a group, they often tell stories of the violence of both their fathers and their mothers. And I guess I'm just thinking contemporaneously about the you know, how Ghislaine Maxwell is treated in the media, for example. I think she's, so far, I mean, obviously there are allegations, but in relation to Epstein, you know, I think he got he got his sort of comeuppance in the media, right? But the same isn't true of how I've been interested in how a female alleged perpetrator might be treated, which is quite interesting.
Well, we'll soon find out, Stephen. When you think about, you know, I was reading some reports yesterday on Maxwell, who was imprisoned a couple of days ago, which is going to be having to stand trial. So it'll be very interesting to see how that unpacks itself.
My experience of the way women who fall foul or are accused of falling foul of the criminal code is that, you know, the weight of punishment will just fall down on their head. I mean, to me, it is, and the statistics bear that out, you know, first-time female offenders for shoplifting are more likely to get a custodial sentence in this country still, because it's seen as such a betrayal of their femininity. And so it's an aggravating feature that you have, you know, you're female and you've breached our criminal codes. And so my experience has been that the punishment will be both swifter and harsher.
This is a fascinating subject that we could maybe go back to on another episode of the podcast in the future. But we have a question here from Stowe, who I'm hoping is from Walthamstow, E17, London. And they say, does low education have more to do with anger and rage? Who's going to take this one? Who wants to go first on this?
Well, one of the main risk factors for violence, for repeated violence, is actually school exclusion. And low education is definitely a risk factor associated with violence. So purely from a statistical point of view, it is, yes.
I think we need to unpack that a little.
Of course, yes.
Because undoubtedly you're right, Stephen. There is this correlation between expulsion from school and then a downward spiral into more aggressive behavior that attracts punishment by the criminal justice system. But I think rather what's going on is that the more educated you are, the better your socio-economic circumstances are, the more you have to lose. So, for example, if I am in my car and I have, an accident, the negative impact of me fleeing that scene to my profession, so my continued ability to earn money is great. I will lose, I'll be disbarred. Whereas if I'm, on a moped and I'm a kid and I've already got a couple of misdemeanors to my name, what's the big deal? So I think it's, I don't know if the questioner is hinting at whether it's an intellect issue or, lack of intelligence. Rather, what I think, in my view, it's more about the stakes. How high are the stakes?
Yeah.
Before
I think it's actually, I think it's both things. It's both. I think it's that you're right to want to unpack that that correlation, because there is an element of that which is undoubtedly about socioeconomic status, and obviously, if you're that's absolutely key. Also, we have to look at it from a kind of more individual point of view as well, which is that it relates to the previous discussion that we've been having about actually having a kind of a language in order to articulate what's going on inside. So if you don't have that, you are at more, there's a greater likelihood of expressing that through action rather than in words.
Right. And we're talking about two different forms of education too. One is academic, which does give you greater options, but there's another neglected education, like you mentioned, and that's a social education. How do we interact with others? How accurate are we in reading what goes on inside us? There's a social education that, romantically may have happened years ago in tribes. Who knows? Maybe it's never happened and it's just now surfacing. But we need an academic education and a social education and models that point the way.
So let me pick up on this just for a moment, just from my experience when I work in schools. When I have worked in schools, I don't tend to do that anymore because it's pretty chaotic, and they certainly can't afford to have somebody like me working with them. However, the girls have always been angrier. They've always been more violent, and you do not want to mess with them. You do not want to mess with them if you're a bloke. Yeah, they'll simply take you out. That's the first comment I want to make. The second one is that in our anger management programs, I've been in situations where men have seen women walk into the room, and it's like, this is completely weird. It's like, women don't get angry. Yeah, so I'm often struck by that. I mean, there's a fantasy that only us blokes get angry, but of course women get angry, and they have every reason to be as angry as they are. I have a view that men are terrified of women's anger, absolutely terrified. Now, I'm not just talking about women's anger, but I'm also talking about their mother's anger, and of course, women represent the archetypal mother. So I do think there's something to be said about that the only way for us to deal with when a woman is raging, not angry, raging, it's absolutely terrifying. I mean, we know the term banshee. When a woman screams and shouts, essentially what it does, it turns men's blood to ice. And you remember the book Snake, Caroline Baker. You remember the book? She did that one on Rapunzel. She talks about the hag, not in a negative form, and there's no male version of the hag. But I mean, when a woman shrills, that most men who are listening to this, and the men that are here, when a woman screams and it kind of hits a very fine point, I mean, it's the most terrifying experience. I don't know if that's true for anybody here, but I know that for myself as a young person. So I do think there's something to be said that actually...
I'd agree. And
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking as you're talking, I would rather take a good punch to the head than a punch to the heart. And what I find in arguments I've had with women and big fights, it's a punch to the heart. It's never a punch to the head.
I mean, I often talk about, I mean, we're going into a really interesting area right now, because there's something about when the mother or the father removes their love, disconnects from the child, it's like an existential death. When the mother, or I think it's more the mother rather than the father, but I don't know if there's sufficient research out there. But there is something so terrifying about that. I know that was true of me. My mother never acted her anger out. She somatized her anger. She got lots of illnesses like migraines, for example, and gallstones and asthma and diabetes. But when she withdrew her love, that for me was like an existential death.
And that's true for women as well with their fathers, that opposite gender. You could easily transpose that either direction.
Yeah, I think we can safely say that anger and explosive anger isn't the preserve of a particular gender. I have,
right.
I think perhaps it's, more frequently manifests itself in men in particular spaces. So, whether it be at the football ground or in the pub. Mm-hmm. But women can pull their punches, and Snake is quite right. When we choose to unleash that weapon, you better be ready.
Yeah. I mean, this kind of folds into something that I found interesting in the live comments, which is from Heretical Free Spirit, who obviously I was drawn to. It is saying, is all anger a bit taboo? I mean, we keep talking about expressing our feelings, making it clear that we're angry, yet still in a positive way. But is anger completely taboo at the same time as seemingly sort of permanently bubbling under the surface and being expressed in, say, passive ways or indeed outbursts? Mike?
Look, from the word go, in my programs, I always talk about anger's here to stay. It ain't going away. It's a survival mechanism that it'll always tell somebody else that, or it'll always tell the individual who's angry that something's not quite right. When somebody crosses a boundary, I'm going to act my anger out. But a lot of the work that I do is helping people to differentiate between passive aggressive, that imploder thing that we're talking about, and anger and active aggression. And then we move into rage, fury, and of course, murder. But I'm very, very supportive of people communicating, expressing anger. However, we have to do it in a kind way. But it does go back to what we were saying earlier on. It's about we need to learn a narrative. in order to communicate our feelings, that it doesn't jar the other person when we express them. And, you know, the person who comes to mind is Marshall Rosenberg, who he wrote a book called Nonviolent Communication. And, you know, he's no longer around, but, you know, I fully support his perspective on we can actually communicate our anger, but we can do it in a way where we start the conversation by simply saying, I'm angry with you. But as you already know, that's not the way we start the conversation. We start conversations, you never, why don't you, you should, what's wrong with you? So we go straight into blaming and shaming. And of course, people are going to react to that. And, you know, that's when it becomes really, really destructive. But Steve, I'm not too sure whether I answered the question.
Yeah, not completely, but it was interesting nonetheless, mate.
Oh, okay.
Anger, is it completely taboo? And I think there seems to be a bit of a disconnect here with this. I mean, I said it earlier, is with the disconnect between sort of Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, everyone talk about their feelings, everyone agreeing on social media, but do we really want to hear about each other's feelings? Isn't it sort of messy and inconvenient?
Well, you know, Snake, you and I have had this conversation many years ago. I mean, you told me about one of the banks in America where part of the description is that you're not allowed to express your anger. So I don't know if you heard that, Snake. Can you hear me, Snake? No, can't hear me.
I'll fill the gap whilst
Go ahead.
Out his audio difficulties. I think the main problem is that we are taught, we don't understand what anger is. We are not taught what true anger is. So when I first met Mike, I thought anger was, you know, throwing a glass at somebody.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Say that again.
When I first met you, Mike, yes. I thought anger was throwing a glass at somebody.
Okay.
But that is an expression of anger. What I didn't understand and what nobody had told me before I met Mike was that you can be angry and just say, I'm angry and this is what I'm angry about. So I think it is taboo because we wrongly think that all anger is about violence. And until we learn or remind ourselves that actually anger is a valid emotion, it's an important one. You know, we have boundaries. We need to make sure that people know when they've crossed a boundary. And there's nothing wrong with expressing anger in a clean and appropriate way. But it's not taught, is the other point that Mike made beautifully. Is we don't teach it, and it should be taught in schools.
How far off?
We have teachers who are losing it all the time, screaming at kids. I mean, yes. Properly screaming at kids. And so they expect children to express anger in a different way. It's just not going to happen.
Yes.
How far off emotional intelligence classes in school are we? Has anyone any idea?
Completely off.
We're very far off. I mean, there are. I think I was telling you there is a organization, a charity that founded by a couple of South Africans recently, been going for about a year, I think it's called Connect something, and they have got a lot of funding from the lottery, and they've already trained up something like 4,000 teachers, and they're in X amount of schools, and it's all about emotional resilience is what they're teaching.
And this is the UK or South Africa? Sorry.
No, the UK.
Oh, right.
Yeah, they're in the UK. And I mean, they're doing fantastic work. And what's great about it, it's part of the curriculum, which makes it even more fascinating.
No,
I think we will see more and more of that
curriculum. And I once went to a parents' evening, and which was all about, I can't even remember the title they gave it. I think it was personal health, emotional. I don't know. I can't remember the phrase, the title. But it was about relationships. But the main focus was the physical part of relationships. So, you know, sex education, and they were teaching this devoid of emotions. I mean, how bizarre is that? I mean, I'm hoping that most of us have been in physical relationships where there's emotion going on, but it wasn't taught alongside, you know, the mechanics of, you know, having sex or having children. We're so disconnected from this. It is madness.
Yeah.
It's a pathology. It's just madness.
Do you have a view, Stephen? Because I mean, your boys, you know, they're at that point now where they're in the process. Well, in fact, one of your kids have already left school. But you know, as an analyst, what are your kids' experience?
I mean, I was just thinking about Sharina's point there, really in relation to the body and the mind, really. We do have a bit of a problem. I think the idea that everything should be expressed is a bit ridiculous, really. I mean, we sort of do these things in our own way, and sometimes we like a bit of privacy, and you know, it's not all about the expression of emotion. And then there are these other emotions which we don't want to be expressed, so we should sort of suppress those ones because they're inconvenient and they don't sort of fit in with that pattern of emotional expression. Now, I guess the thing about anger and what we're talking about, especially rage itself, is something that is very bodily felt. That's where the problem arises, isn't it? There's one level of engaging with the world, which is about the mind, and then suddenly we're a body who actually feels a flood of adrenaline, and your heart starts racing, and you want to thump somebody, or and you don't quite have the words to express that. And I think there is a kind of major issue in our kind of Western culture about integrating the mind and the body and actually being a body. You know, we've also become so cerebral that you know, what happens to us as bodies? It's an inconvenient thing. It's embarrassing, and we should sort of get rid of it. We should sort of chop off rage. You know, that's bad.
I think that's another
interesting. I heard
excellent.
a good quote that fit into that, and it was a woman whose husband had come back after a long deployment, and her comment to her husband was, if this relationship is going to work, you're going to have to come up with something beyond hungry, horny, or angry. You got to have some more emotion than that. And so we are talking about lessening this hierarchy to at least go explore, if not express, the range of emotion that we have as human beings.
Yeah. And related to that, Snake, I think is the other point I just wanted to make quickly, which is about a culture which is much more associated with what is trying to grab what is most expedient rather than what is most meaningful.
Right.
You know, so we want to just sort of satiate that particular appetite rather than actually engage with the appetite for whatever that is, sex or rage or whatever, and think about what that actually means, that it might actually connect two human beings together or disconnect two human beings together, and finding some kind of level of actually where we're finding meaning in our lives rather than just sort of these, you know, satisfying a particular appetite for something.
Yeah.
So, guys, we're going to go to some questions from the live audience. We've only got 10 minutes left, so be super concise if you possibly can. So I like this question from Tanya in the Facebook group. And she's talking about how she works with men who think crying is a weakness. And what are everyone's thoughts on whose responsibility it is to teach children that it's okay to cry? Now, crying, of course, has a lot of sort of biological, biochemical benefits. You know, over to you guys for the science on that?
Well, let me just respond immediately. So I remember reading an article many years ago that 65% of education is actually done in the home, which I found quite extraordinary. So, I will immediately go to is that as parents, they have to model healthy anger, appropriate anger, but not only appropriate anger, but also self-esteem, compassion, empathy, and I think leave the rest up to teachers. But I do think it starts with parents modeling emotional intelligence and emotional resilience. That's my view.
We're also hearing here from INMO, who say they have for the last 5 years run an 18-month program called Progression in schools in London and Manchester that deals with emotional intelligence and resilience. So there you go, positive news there. How do the parents here feel about teaching children to cry? And
I think
encouragement.
I think there is a difference. We should, I mean, obviously there's a range of different family constellations, aren't there? Not everybody is in a family with a
can drink or something.
There's quite a, sorry guys, there's quite a lot of crackling, and I'm not too sure who that is. So it's really.
Is somebody's on a keyboard? I think somebody's on a keyboard. That's what it sounds like.
It might be whoever it is, just to put themselves on mute so we can hear everybody.
It's not Sharina.
No.
I'm going to have a go at this question and try and just talk over the noise. Obviously there are different constellations of family structure, and the family with a mother and father, with a man and a woman, is no longer the only model of family, right? But I think there is something about the contribution that each of the mother and the father have to the child, which is actually quite important and has to be found in a family where there's where there's a man and a man, or a woman and a woman. But I was thinking particularly about the father's responsibility in this area. There's a lot of research which actually shows that where fathers are absent, there's a much greater chance of criminality, poor educational attainment, and including very poor health and mental health outcomes as well. One fascinating study actually shows that there's something called a telomere, which is the cap on the end of the DNA strand, right? It's a bit like the plastic on the end of a shoelace, which holds the DNA strand in place and helps the cell replicate. In situations where there's an absent father, the child's telomere will be actually 14% shorter, which then corresponds with a shorter life expectancy. And the very interesting thing about this is that actually, when you look at the difference between boys and girls, boys are differentially affected by that by 40%. So they have a worse outcome without a father present.
Right, we see. So
fascinating. That's really interesting, because I know there was also research about the presence of fathers in the home and girls coming to maturity. So with the fathers absent, girls come into puberty earlier. And there's evidence that they are more promiscuous too when fathers are absent from the home.
So last question from Jen via email. And she says, how can people be so animated online yet so passive in real life? And she's talking not just about the content of what they're saying, but also the way they express themselves. So how can people be more, how come they're often more expressive online than they are in person?
Is she talking about us?
No, I
the
think
so-called big guns
we actually
on
got
anger management.
a week in the lead up, mate, rather than during the podcast. So it's no, she's not. She's not talking. Not everything's about you, dude. So
I think Snake should take this one, because Snake had an interesting point before we came on air about this one.
dude, you
Can't
mute.
hear you, Snake.
Here we go.
Yeah. I think it's that there's no consequence online. So
Yes.
to a certain degree, the word I'd put to it is cowardice. It's far less consequence to let rip online and be cantankerous and objectionable, where you would never do that face to face. The risk is too high.
Yes. Yes.
So online, we might not be anonymous, but we're definitely at a distance. No one can throw anything at us.
Well, actually, they are sometimes anonymous too, Snake. I mean, there are forums and chat rooms where you can create a profile with a pseudonym. So
Sure.
there's absolutely no consequences. We can't even find who you are.
Yeah, I have a view on
The
this.
real hazard that I see with a lot of the online life is that it is kind of like television or entertainment. It's a faux representative of relationship, of the interaction between humans, where risk is diminished and expression is encouraged, but it really is a placebo in many ways.
I like what you said there, Freud. You made a Freudian slip there, Snake, on lifers. I don't know if you heard that. Yeah, on lifers. So, you know, I have a very particular view about this, because my view is that there are times, I do this less now because I also got the pushback. But, you know, there's times when I'm just grumpy and I go online and I hear something or I read something on Facebook or you know, I see a tweet and it's like I push back, but people push back as well. So I've had to learn to tone it down, because there's always going to be fallout. And, you know, the last thing I want is somebody trolling me. I just don't like that. I just think it's unbelievably disrespectful. And Bruce is already saying, you know, it's cowardly. It has no consequence.
But I also think people who engage in that sort of angry online behavior, I think they're lonely.
Yes.
I think they're lonely.
Yes.
Because, I mean, you know, you see sometimes the conversation goes on and on and on, and you think, how have you got the time to engage with this? I've barely got time.
Well, what happens is, you see, I think that I think it's also perhaps to do, it's not just, I mean, lonely is, I guess a lot of people are really sort of troubled on their own, right? And the online figure becomes a kind of a convenient sort of hook to hang some kind of internal persecutor, so that this gets sort of projected onto this sort of public figure, and then the external person is attacked rather than the figure being an internal one. I mean, it's what Freud said about projection, that it's the very first defense mechanism, because it's expedient, because it's easier to have, if you've got an internal persecutor in your own mind, you can't actually run away or fight that persecutor. But if you project that out externally onto an external figure, you can then either fight or flee from that feared stimulus.
Go on forever. Oh, my.
Sorry, I just have to pick up on what Stephen's saying, because, you know, we're now moving to the realms of shadow projection. And I remember one of the situation I found myself in a group, Stephen, was somebody said, like, where does the shadow come from? And for years and years and years, I've been trying to figure that out until I read Freud's perspective on the fantasy bond. And you're describing the same thing. You know, when we come from a family, when we're so terrified of the consequences, we then project that anger, rage, and fury out onto the world. because we need to be seen safe and protected by our parental figures, especially when the light goes off at night. Interesting place to end, Stephen.
Yeah, Mike Fisher brings it into the chat. So everybody, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thanks to our panel, Sharina Brown.
Thank you.
Craig Snake Bloomstrand. On drums, Stephen Blumenthal. And on keyboards, Mike Fisher. So remember that you can follow us on our various different social media channels, Facebook /BAAM UK, YouTube /Beating Anger, and of course the website angermanage.co.uk. We're going to be back with another Wisdom Track podcast on the 15th of August, when we're going to be talking about practical wisdom for the 21st century. Do we have time for the video, or we got to wrap it up?
Yeah, let's have the time for the video.
We got the time for the video. Yeah. Guys, here is the video that is going to introduce to you our new project here at the British Association of Anger Management. It's called the Wisdom Track. We think you're going to love it. Here's how you find out all about it. We will see you again on August the 15th. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful weekend.
Mike Fisher has been in the personal and professional development field for over 3 decades. Some of you might know Mike already, attended his anger management programs, or even read some of his books on anger. I'm talking to you today to introduce his new web launch, the Wisdom Track. If you split the word wisdom, you get wise domain. In other words, to inhabit the domain of the wise. And that's the purpose of the Wisdom Track. It's a platform to engage with wise thinking in order to reaffirm who we are in the world and our place in it. It's easy to get lost in the barrage of information that is spewed out to us in every direction daily. But are we able to discern what is true, false, or even critical? We are subjected to the sleights of misinformation with hidden agendas, but do we ever stop to think whether this is enriching the mind or poisoning it? Are we shaping ourselves, or are we allowing all these messages to shape us? Despite all the connectivity of technology, has it in fact made us more vulnerable to being shaped by external forces? And how does this affect our awareness or consciousness, both individually and collectively? You see, there's a personal element to wisdom too. It's different for all of us. It's about finding yourself, knowing what your boundaries and values are, and having a clear dialogue with your inner voice that instinctively knows what's the best course of action for you. We have an inner landscape that is important for us to inhabit. Otherwise, we lose touch not only with ourselves, but with our place in the world, our purpose, and our environment. We are already witnessing the consequences of this disconnection in our world, the lack of care, respect, and connection towards each other, as well as our one and only planet. COVID-19 has given us a rare opportunity to stop consuming and bring our focus into what is essential. So, what is essential for you? Sometimes becoming wise is about asking different questions. The Wisdom Track platform is a place where we can do all of that, where we get to talk, share, listen, and evolve together.